Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. It's now 2 o'clock Eastern, or 11 o'clock here in Pacific time. So my name is Peter Kong. I'm a board member of the Society of Scholar Priests, and I'm also our webinar coordinator. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for our second webinar of the 2018-2019 academic year. Walt Knowles is going to be talking with Scott Gunn, the Executive Director of Forward Movement, about the new book he co-wrote with Melody Wilson Shobe, Walk in Love, Episcopal Beliefs and Practices. This webinar is going to be recorded and the video will be available on YouTube later, and also the audio will come out as a podcast. You can find more information about that at our website, which is scholarpriests.org, and also our Facebook page, for the Society of Scholar Priests. Right now, I've got all new people coming into the meeting. You'll be muted, but during the question and answer session, you can unmute yourself, or if you like, you can type your questions into the chat box, and we'll make sure that Scott sees those. So without any further ado, turn it over to Walt and take it away.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome, Scott. Scott, we all know as one half of the Supreme Executive Committee of Lent Madness, and secondarily, the Executive Director of Forward Movement. And as someone who's been watching Forward Movement for quite a while, there's been a really great improvement in its action and place in the church with Scott's leadership. And Scott, I want to thank you very much for that leadership. Besides being the director of Forward Movement, previously he was a parish priest in Rhode Island, which is where he and Melody Shobe got to know each other. And has a handful of books out as well. So, as a new book, or relatively new book, Scott, would you basically give us a sort of 5,000-foot view of what Walk in Love is all about?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here, and I've been cheering all of you scholar priests from the sidelines, from the pamphlet empire. So thank you all for all that you do. And the other thing I just want to mention quickly is Melody's last name is a little tricky, and sometimes people get it wrong. But just so you know, for the record, she pronounces her last name Shobe, is one syllable. Anyway, but this book, Walk in Love, and I should have gotten the Spanish version. It's also has been translated into Spanish as Anden en Amor. But Melody and I wrote it for a couple of reasons. One narrative I could give you, which is true, is that when we were parish priests together in Rhode Island, we never quite found an introduction to Anglicanism that we thought was satisfactory for at least the people crossing our threshold, who were people who may be churched or sometimes were unchurched. They often had pretty decent education, but never a kind of theological education. So a lot of the options that are out there are wonderful, but they either require a kind of cerebral familiarity with reading church books, or they're peddling a particular view of the Episcopal Church. They want to describe it as we're a progressive church, or we're a conservative church, or whatever. And so Melody and I wanted a book that was accessible, that taught the same things that the prayer book teaches, and that was that tried to normalize prayer book belief and practice. So that's what it is, and it's an overview of the first part of it's kind of a commentary on the prayer book and sacraments and sacramental rites, and then there's a bit about the liturgical year and the passage of time, some of the markers of the passage of time, And then there's a section on various beliefs and spiritual practices. And we tried to shape it around the questions that we had encountered from seekers and guests and newcomers. So that was kind of when we were trying to decide what to put in and what to not put in the table of contents, really the question was, has anyone ever asked us about this? Is this the thing people want to know when they're new around here? And that's kind of how we shaped it. It's got 26 chapters. It's there are discussion questions at the end of every chapter, and there's a bibliography in the back that we think are. We also try to be careful about that. The Walk in Love is aimed very much at a general reader, so it doesn't assume a lot of knowledge at all. And the resources in the back are the things that we thought would be a logical next step. So somebody finishes the 2 chapters on Eucharist and says, I want to learn more about the Holy Eucharist. What are the next reasonable things that a person would read? Not the best books out there that maybe you'd have to have an MDiv to understand, but what are the next things we would recommend somebody in the real world who asks us these things? And then the last thing I'll say is there's also, I guess the second part of the narrative of why we wrote the book is also important to this next part. There's a free curriculum that goes with Walk in Love that you can use with or without the book. And the free curriculum is called Practicing Our Faith. About 4 or 5 years ago, I spent all my time asking people around the church what they were up to, what they were doing, what they weren't doing. And what I learned is that almost no Episcopal parishes have any meaningful adult Christian formation offerings in their church. Keep in mind that the median Sunday attendance of an Episcopal church is 55 people, so half of our churches are teeny tiny. But even some of the ones that are big enough to have offerings, instead of having meaningful adult formation, they might have a current events discussion that uses the Sunday's lectionary as a jumping off point, but it's not really what you'd call Christian formation. So at Forward Movement, we can't solve all the problems, but we try. We got a grant from the Constable Fund to create 3 years worth of curricula for parishes that are free, as in 0 cost, downloadable curricula. 1 year is Practicing Our Faith, 1 year is Exploring the Bible, and 1 year is Celebrating the Saints. And so another reason we wrote Walk in Love was as a resource for that 3rd and final year that's finished now. And all those things that I just mentioned, the free curricula, are available in English or Spanish, and they're free. So anyway, that was a little bit of an infomercial and a long answer to your question.
Thank you for the infomercial. That's very valuable.
I feel good about hawking free stuff. I get a little squeamish when I'm telling people to spend their money, but hawking free stuff seems okay. Anyway,
I think one of the things as I read through Walk in Love is how unsurprising the book is, and I mean that in the best possible way. It was as I read through it, it was this sort of sense of being at home. But of course, one of the things that surprised me about it was the lack of agenda that it presented. It was not trying to push me to go somewhere, but to help me understand where I'm at. And I think that's incredibly valuable. One thing that surprised me, and I think this is probably a good thing given the audience that you are doing the book for, is that I didn't, in the way that one usually does in reading academic material, I didn't learn anything. Few things I realized, but I didn't learn anything. So since we're scholar priests trying to work out our vocation, I think the question to you is, what did you learn while you were writing it?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think one thing is there is a little bit of an agenda for the book, which is and it gets reflected in a number of the reviewers who have written about it have said the authors quoted the Bible and the prayer book unapologetically. And it's in my opinion, a sad state of the commentary it's a sad commentary on the state of affairs in our church that's notable. But really our agenda is, is the prayer book's fine. It actually, the Christian faith that is taught in the prayer book, or the Christian faith as taught by the prayer book, whatever language you want to use, is really fine, and we don't have to apologize for it. We ought to just learn it. And so that is a little bit of an agenda. And there are some of the liturgical practices that we try to normalize the way things ought to be done, hoping that maybe in all those parishes where I know they're not doing it that way, somebody reads the book and they have a little side conversation with their priest. Hey, it says right here on page 73 that we ought to be doing it this way. Why are we doing it this other way? So I hope that happens somewhere. But I think, it's not meant to be. It's apologia, right? I mean, we're trying to explain the faith. We're not trying to break any new ground here. We're not trying to carve out a new way of understanding the prayer book or scripture study or how to be a Christian. We're just trying to articulate some of the basics. So I think I learned also, I'm trying to remember some good examples. I learned all sorts of little things because in the course of writing a book like this, I mean, it's pretty, the scope of it's pretty comprehensive. So I had to read around and dust off some old notes and old memories from seminary and when I had been taught. I think one of the things I've learned in writing the book, but also in the reception to it, is that how do I put this? There is a delightful and a surprising eagerness to embrace the traditional Christian faith. I think sometimes I hear a narrative that we need to be clever because people are craving cleverness. And first of all, that hasn't been my experience. But second of all, in writing the book, I sort of freshly fell in love with the gospel. And in the response to it, it's sold better than any forward movement book in I don't know when. Certainly in my 7 years, this is a bestseller for us. And I think the response to it has been almost universally positive because I think exactly it's not clever and it just unapologetically says, actually, this faith that we have is pretty awesome. Let's just dive into it.
Thank you. As you structured this, I'm sort of wondering if you're telling us something in the structure. You start with the prayer book and our worship life together, then beliefs, then that little section on the Trinitarian life, which one might say is the only theology proper in here, even though the entire thing as a liturgical theologian is very much a liturgical theology.
Sure.
And then a little bit of practical stuff. Are you basically making a theological or ecclesiological point with your organization, or is that just a good way of organizing things?
A little of the second, but I think there are a couple points that we're trying to make. One is that as Anglicans, our common worship life really shapes our Anglican identity. And so if we're going to write a book on Anglican belief and practices, it better be rooted in and start with the prayer book. So that is kind of a theological statement. Then there's a little bit of it's arbitrary. Then there's that section, there's a 3-chapter section for those of you who don't have the book or haven't looked at it yet, called, I'll try to hold it up so you can see it, A Trinitarian Life. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit of an experiment on our part. And I've been pleasantly surprised. I thought maybe it would receive more criticism, but it was a little bit of an experiment to say, we talk about, I get very frustrated when we start talking about the Holy Trinity, because I think our typical approach is to try to either simplify it in unhelpful ways, or just treat it as an abstraction that's meant to be memorized. When I actually think if we take it seriously, it ought to shape how we live as Christians, among other things. It also is a theological concept worthy of learning and exploring. But so these 3 chapters were a little bit of an exploration to say, are there implications in how we live that are caused by the fact that we believe in a triune God? And so that was a little bit, that was our big risky move in the book. Other than ending with 2 chapters on evangelism, but there's kind of a movement. Is you sort of start with our common prayer and move through some things, and then the evangelism bit is meant to send you off. It's a little bit like the cover, which is many of you probably figured it out. That's St. James Cathedral in Chicago. And one person asked me, I did a Q&A, and one person asked me, does the chancel really look like that? And I, of course, said, no, there's not a forest and a path in the chancel of the cathedral in Chicago. But the point of it is we were trying to convey visually this idea that our life as Christians, the heart of our life as Christians is worshiping together. But then we live our Christian lives mostly outside the church, right? I mean, just math, 166 hours outside the church, a couple hours inside the church every week. So yeah, I guess that was a little bit of a theological and a little bit of a practical sense.
Thank you. Since you wrote this as a book for adult formation, how do you see us? I mean, if you could. You've got some curricular elements. How would you see us in our parish life using this particular book?
Yeah. So I know it's been used several ways. One way to use it is the reason that all of our Constable Grant funded resources are 26 sections is that the idea was we thought they could be used over the course of a single program year. So you start in September, and by the time most churches get started, the 2nd or 3rd week in September, and you take some time off for Christmas and Easter and other various parish occasions like annual meeting Sunday or whatever. 26 weeks later, 26 sessions later, you end up in May when everyone's kind of done. And so one way to use the book would be to just use it with the curriculum or without, or not use the curriculum and just do a Sunday morning, Sunday forum, or a midweek class and do it over the course of a program year. Some churches have done it. It could be, Melody and I, a couple weeks ago, recorded a 5-part video class through Church Next. So we'll have a 5-week video-based curriculum available this Lent. So if somebody wants to do the 5 Sundays of Lent, 5 Sundays in Lent, either on Sunday morning or midweek, we'll have that sorted out for them. People have used it for inquirers. People have used it, a couple places have used it for confirmation. And what we deliberately wrote the book and we tried to put all the references and page numbers in, believing that it would be, that not everybody who uses the book would read it straight through. So we hope it's the case that if you take a confirmation class and the instructor says, start with chapter 8 and then read chapter 12 and chapter 16, whatever, that all the core reference are there. We think it's a better experience if you read the whole thing, but if you don't, we tried to make it work so that you could sort of pluck out chapters and it would still make sense.
Now there's a few things as I read through it that I found missing, and I'm wondering what you're telling us with this. One thing that since I do most of my ministry in music, that I noticed wasn't there was what originally brought me into the Anglican Communion, and to be real honest, keeps me here, and that's the place of music. And in fact, maybe even more the place of performed liturgy. We've got this prayer book, but I didn't get a sense in reading it of the community really doing the liturgy as the core of this, or the community singing together.
Right. No, it's a fair point. There are all sorts of things that are missing because we had to leave stuff on the cutting room floor because we didn't. The book's already big at 330, 340 pages, and we didn't want to make it any bigger. But music, it's really interesting you say that for music. As Walter and I spoke yesterday, and as I told him, it was actually, I'm a musician. I studied music as an undergraduate, and I spent 2 decades working as a church musician before I was ordained. And we didn't put music stuff in there, I think partly because I probably more than Melody have very strong opinions. And I didn't want to, we tried.
There's strong opinions in it.
Yes. We tried really hard not to make the book a collection of personal rants, although there's a little there are a few, I'll be honest. But it was our managing editor, believe it or not, Rochelle Thompson, who works at Forward Movement, who, when she read it, she sent back, I think it was either the Baptism or the Eucharist chapters. She sent them back, and one of her notes was in big red letters, because, in a big red pen, no music, add music. And she's, of course, right. So I think if we were doing a second edition, or I would probably put more stuff in there, to the point of what you said, not so much about how it ought to be or what's good music and bad music, but the importance of community song, the importance for the fact that most Christians in most of history have sung most of the liturgy, that this idea of a spoken Eucharist is a modern novelty, and frankly something to be suppressed, but that's another story. So yeah, it's music's missing. There's not much in there on stewardship. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff that's missing.
So is there a second, you said second edition, is there a second volume?
Yeah, so a couple of people have said, well, is there going to be a sequel? And I keep thinking, well, there could be, but every time I say that, I immediately follow up with, what do you want to see in it? And they just say more of the same. We loved it. We just want more. So if anyone on this webinar if anyone has suggestions for what they'd like to see in another volume, I'd be up for it. Melody in particular needs to recover. This is my day job, so it's easy for me to make the time and churn out half a book. It's harder when it's not your day job. So, but yeah, we'd be up for it. It was a lot of fun to write.
I think one of the things that I end up teaching an online course for CDSP on the prayer book. And the one thing that I find resources hardest to get to is more material on the pastoral offices and the other 5 sacraments. You fly by them, they're there, and that's good. And of course, Derek's book just gets to the point where you say, okay, now tell me about this, and he quits because it's 300 pages long.
Just so you all know, I am begging, every time I talk to Derek, I beg him to crank out the successor to Inwardly Digest. So if any of you see Derek, tell him that you're desperate for the second volume, because we want to publish it really badly.
Well, I think we beat up on him fairly strongly at our conference in May in Austin, where he was one of our speakers. to do that second volume.
Yeah.
So I guess that leads me into to what's my final sort of question on this is Forward Movement's a great resource for the church, and thank you again for that. But what can we as individual scholar priests and as scholar priests do to work with you, to encourage you, to help you in the ministry that you've taken on?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I will say it's been a great blessing to serve at Forward Movement. And one of the reasons we've been able to expand and do all sorts of great things is that my predecessor and my predecessor's predecessor, going back, were really good leaders. And the organization was a little sleepy, but really healthy when I came. And so there's a lot of wonderful stuff about Forward Movement that I can't take any credit for because it was already true when I got there. And I get to work with really great people. I think one of the things that has been a real concern of mine is for us to stay really very strictly focused on discipleship. And I see evangelism, by the way, as an outgrowth of discipleship. It's a thing disciples do. We talk about them separately because it's evangelism's au courant, and it's with good reason. It should be, but discipleship's the thing. It's why the church exists. It's why it's what we ought to be doing is making disciples and being disciples. Discipleship is the thing. And so Forward Movement, we've really focused on that. And I'm always asking the question, what can the church do to make disciples in the 21st century? What can we do to nurture the disciples that we have? And so that's why we're doing all kinds of different things and publishing books and conferences and apps and doing fun, silly things and more serious things. But most of what we do, 90% of what we do is geared at people who sit in a pew, at ordinary worshipers who come to church who aren't ever going to take an EFM class, who aren't going to go to seminary. They do church. They're church is part of their lives, but it's not their life. And so Forward Movement's speciality, which again I inherited and did nothing about, is Forward Movement is really good at publishing accessible resources that ordinary people who come to church can pick up and read. And I want us to continue that. And there are plenty of other publishers who do other kinds of more cerebral, more scholarly works, and I'm grateful for it, and I buy them. What you all could do is, there's a couple things. I think one thing is, I don't think it'll be controversial. We have this huge catechetical crisis in our church, and a shocking number of lay people and even clergy don't understand what baptism means, don't have basic baptismal theology. So it's hard to have a baptismal ecclesiology if you don't know what baptism is. And it's silly to preach about the baptismal covenant all the time if you're not actually talking about the implications of baptism. And Eucharist is the same thing. And you can see it in the conversation. Now I'm just going to be a little provocative. You can see in the conversation on communion without baptism, the way that conversation shakes out. There probably are good theological cases to be made for communion without baptism, but they're none of the ones that we usually hear. And that whole conversation is a reflection of our catechetical crisis. So one thing the scholar priest can do is teach the faith to lots of people, and especially leaders in the church, so that we leaders are not leading people down the wrong path. We would love to publish more resources. We were glad to publish Derek's book. I wasn't sure how it would do because it's a little more, it requires a little more, it's a little more taxing than some of the other things we've published. But it's done very well, and we'd like to do more books like that. So if you have ideas for books and the thing that's great about Derek's book is it's challenging, but the payoff is you really get a better understanding of what the prayer book's about and why it matters. And so we'd love to do more books like that. I'm very interested in, I've had two ideas that are not rocket science that I don't have the time to do, and I'm probably not clever enough to do them, either one of them very well, but somebody on here might be. One is to just create a reader of material from the first few centuries of the church, whatever a better way to say patristic period is, but to create a reader to make some of our church tradition and history accessible for people. There are lots of readers out there already, I know about them, but create one for the Episcopal Church that speaks to our context. So that's one idea that I've had floating that's kicking around. Another one that I've been wanting to do for a long time is to find great sermons from the Bible onward, like the dedication of the temple, first temple, all the way through Jesus and Paul, and so biblical sermons, but also early church sermons. Like I love John Chrysostom's Nativity sermon, his lesser known cousin, which is equally spectacular to his Easter sermon. But people don't know these things. And so a compendium, a reader, which is, that requires a scholarly approach, because somebody has to be discerning on what to pick and how to frame it, how to introduce it in a way that's that helps people along in seeing in knowing our story and in knowing our context. And those are just example ideas. There are probably a million more out there that I would love. Right now we're trying to figure out how to solve this. We have several things coming out on Eucharist. I know, and we've got a bunch of scripture stuff. I know that one of the most important catalysts for spiritual growth, because of our renewal works research, we know that one of the most important catalysts for spiritual growth is to teach people to have a habit of daily prayer. Doesn't have to be the daily office, just a habit of daily prayer. Get somebody reading the Bible and praying every day, and it's very likely they're going to become a more and more mature Christian. So we have lots of stuff on scripture engagement. We have lots of prayer resources, but we don't really have anything right now that you could hand somebody to say, this will help you learn how to pray. And this, by the way, is a classic example of something we do in the church all the time, where we say prayer is good. But I don't know what your all's experience has been, but when I actually talk to parishioners, they say, yeah, I want to pray, I just don't know how. I just don't know where to start. And they're afraid to ask because they assume that everyone else has it figured out. And of course, no one does. And so we need resources on some really basic stuff like that. And the reason it's good to come from scholars is because you all can, we don't have to be clever here. We don't have to make up new ways to pray. We just have to dig up some of the ones that have been working pretty well for the last few millennia.
Great, thank you. It really seems to me that in the last few years, whether you want to credit your predecessors or your work, that forward movement has moved out of, my image of forward movement 15 years ago was forward day by day and some tracks.
Yep.
And my image of forward movement now is essentially the organization that's trying to take on the catechetical crisis for adults. And so that's something we really ought to, and I know we do want to help out with and find ways that we can participate in that. And thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I hopefully there's time for questions, but I also want to just put out a quick invitation. If any of you ever find yourselves in Cincinnati, do stop by our office. We pray, our staff prays every day at 10 o'clock for a few minutes. There's a place on our website you can put in prayer requests. And so we pray whatever intercessions we've been asked to pray and read forward day by day and say a couple other prayers every day at 10 o'clock. And we'd love for you to join us then. But come by, and we always send our visitors away with free stuff. And we'd love to see you. So it's a mutual thing. Thanks for having me here. And so now is my invitation to come over to my house sometime.
Thank you. Peter, let's open up for questions.
Great. So if you have questions for Scott, you just need to unmute yourself, or you can type something in the chat. So I have already, Kara says something in the chat. A frequent conversation I have conflates evangelism and outreach, especially using the spurious quote from Francis, "Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words." How can we stay focused on evangelism that is really evangelism and not outreach or social service?
Yes, that is, yes to all of that. I think the important thing is it gets back to teaching. We have to teach people what is evangelism. Evangelism is literally the proclamation of good news, specifically the proclamation of good news about Jesus. So it may be that we do practice evangelism when we feed someone. That's possible. But it doesn't necessarily follow, of course, that being kind, to put it another way, this is one of my frequent rants that I see when sometimes I see stuff on social media and I'm swearing and so forth, there's a difference between being an evangelist and being a decent human being. I hope that every Christian is at minimum a decent human being, or strives to be. And even a person of no faith can be a decent human being. Feeding other people is what decent human beings do. Christian evangelism needs to kick it up a notch. If we're gonna say our evangelism is our mission work, then we need to be kicking it up a notch. And so, yeah, I just think. But the problem is that most Episcopalians, and I'm saying this not judgmentally. This is based on research we have. Most Episcopalians, one of the reasons they can't practice evangelism is they don't actually know the story. They don't know they can't articulate what Jesus has done for them. And like they say on the airplane, put on your own mask before you help someone else. So this is why before evangelism, we have to have discipleship. But it gets back to teaching. And first, when someone says something like that, well, first of all, there's no way Francis would have said that, because he was, guess what, a preacher. And yeah, okay, so we should feed people. Yes, that's good. Let's do it. But also, we need to be telling people the good news of God and Jesus Christ. And by the way, so I think the two things, if we're going to say this is true in the church, the one thing we need to do is we need to remind people and preach all the time what is the good news. And so that asks us as a denomination to up our preaching game and not just offer kind of NPR-like commentaries on current events that pass for sermons, but actually preach the good news every Sunday. And it also requires us to help people know what that proclamation looks like, because like everything else in life, it gets easier with practice, so people just need help knowing here are some ways to do it.
Do you want to follow up on that, Kara?
Kara said she's good. So other questions, you can type it in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask in person.
And as I said to Walter, if there's something you didn't like in Walk in Love, if you had a chance to read it, if something bothered you, or you just thought was plain out wrong, I'm happy to have receive criticism as well. I promise you it won't hurt my feelings.
Got a question here from Roger Patience. I particularly appreciate the Forward Movement app for the daily office. What have you seen, or what does your research suggest that works well for teaching people about the offices and other prayer practices?
Yeah, so we don't, I'd have to go back and look. Probably if we interrogated our data with that question, I probably could learn some things. I can tell you anecdotally, both from my time as a parish priest and when I talk to people now, when I travel all the time, people people are obviously wired differently, and so one person's habit of daily prayer could very well look different from someone else's habit of daily prayer. I think one of the things with teaching people the daily office is these days it's so much easier than, you know, when I was a youngster learning with a big pile of books and ribbons, which is how, by the way, how I prefer to pray it still. But these days it's so much easier because there are websites and apps, including the Forward Movement one. But I think helping people know why it's worth the bother, that you make it through a bunch of scripture. These prayers are themselves scriptural articulations of scripture. You're joining in prayer with Christians and with Anglicans around the world and through time and space when you do this. You know, all the things that we all know. Helping people understand that, yeah, it's a little more complicated, but it's kind of worth it, helps. But then I think letting people know that there are other ways to pray. I, for example, suck at contemplative prayer. I just can't do it. I've tried over and over again. I'll keep trying someday. I just can't. And for a while, I tell this story a lot. In fact, I think it's in the book. I beat myself up for a while thinking I was a failure as a Christian because somebody had told me that I should be doing contemplative prayer, and I just couldn't. And finally, somebody said, well, that's just not how you pray. So get over it. And so I think one of the things we can do is sort of like like a coach, is help people explore some different options for prayer. But the office in particular, I think, requires some teaching to help people understand what they're looking at, the structure of it, and what some of the benefits are and where it came from and so forth. By the way, I think it's true that there are lots of daily office options. I believe ours is the only one. My goal was 100% fidelity to the Book of Common Prayer, with nothing added, deleted, removed, you know, not a jot or a tittle added or removed. So occasionally we find a glitch, and when somebody alerts us to a glitch, we fix it. But we try really hard to be faithful to the prayer book. We're going to be coming out with an update at some point in the not too distant future that will add Spanish to our daily office prayer app, and also allow you the option of turning on some material from the St. Augustine prayer book, like the Marian four offices and stuff. So if you're a person like me who likes to say the Angelus, you'll have an option to turn that stuff on.
I think I'll drop you a note. One of the things that I found most useful in teaching my parishioners to do the daily office was I did a quick reference card that basically said, skip all these options that you've got. Here's how to do it.
Yeah.
On, you know, a double-sided piece of paper. And once people realized that they didn't have to figure out this huge code, it was much less daunting.
Yeah, I just read this book recently, Issues in Prayer Book Revision, Volume 1, which is fantastic. Like every collection of essays, they're not all fantastic, but most of them are pretty good. And the collection's fantastic. But one of the points that book makes is we really did not do our church a favor by having so many options in our prayer book. And so it's the daily office is the perfect example of that. You know, morning prayer will kick your butt if you're new at it. So yeah, the quick reference card helps.
Got a couple more comments here. So Bob is saying, I was going to perhaps ask this privately, but why not sponsor Derek's in order to handle the options, etc.?
Yeah, so Derek actually is the programmer behind ours as well, as you may know. And we are, I think, I believe what's likely to happen is we're going to actually combine the code base, and we'll probably still have a Forward Movement one, and there'll probably be a St. Bede's breviary, but they'll be more similar than they are different. He might keep some calendar options that we won't have, but the code base will be the same. So yes, we're thinking alike, Bob.
And Roger makes another comment. I've done daily office basics videos and blog posts, but I'm always looking for more helps. More that helps.
Yeah, we probably need to publish a little pamphlet or a video or something that just helps people. I visited St. James Church. We had a Forward Movement Board of Directors meeting last month at St. James Church in Madison Avenue, which has done amazing discipleship work, by the way. But they have morning and evening prayer every day. They decided as a parish they were going to commit to prayer, and one of the ways they were going to do that is have a lay-led morning and evening prayer every day, and so they do. And I went to it, and it had been a while since I'd been to a lay-led morning prayer in a parish. They're not all that common anymore. And all the people who did it did a fantastic job. They did really well, and they had you could tell they had a little card. But I was struck sitting there in the way that sometimes you see something you've seen before, but in a new way, watching these people juggle the sanctoral book and the Bible and the prayer book, all the books and ribbons and stuff. And I was just thinking, gosh, it's really impressive that this person learned all this, that someone taught them all this, that they did it really well. And it's worth the effort because it's lovely.
Can I make a comment on that, actually?
Oh, please.
Would that be okay? No, I've been reading a lot of Martin Thornton recently, particularly his work he writes on ascetical theology, working through his English spirituality right now. And I've just been thinking, as you've been talking about his kind of threefold anchor, really, for Christian proficiency is the Mass or the Eucharist, the daily office, and then private prayer. And what you said about St. James just reminded me of Thornton's insistence that the daily office is the prayer of the church. And we as a body have sort of fallen down, on the job on that one. But that the daily office is not there sort of to feed our own individual spirituality, but rather it's the offering of praise to God by the whole body. And then there is kind of the responsibility or the call to find a way to pray throughout the day. Thornton talks about habitual recollection as sort of the typical Anglican way. But I just want to kind of hold up that threefold anchor and just maybe think about, I'm wondering, what would it take for the church as a whole to recover the daily office as the prayer of the church? I know not every church is St. James and Madison Avenue, but that's certainly that makes my heart glad to hear that they're doing that. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, no, I agree with that, and it makes me think I should reread some more Thornton and just get it back in my head. But one of the things I always tell people when I'm talking about the daily office, I think this is in Walk in Love, is I always say one of the beautiful things about praying morning prayer, evening prayer, is even if you're by yourself, you're never alone, because you're joining in the prayer of the church. Exactly that point. You're offering by yourself, you're joining in the prayer of the universal church. It's interesting. The Church of England has all kinds of flaws and things that I would not want to emulate. But one thing that I really admire very much about the Church of England is their canonical requirement that all clergy have to say morning and evening prayer every day, and that it should be offered in every parish church every day. And I believe that their church is stronger in ways that ours isn't because of that. I suspect most clergy in the Episcopal Church today don't say the daily office, and I will confess, there are days I miss as well. I also know that I'm a better Christian and a better priest when I manage to be in the habit of it, every day. But getting back to this, the kind of threefold order, I think our coming at it from another way with our Renewal Works data. There's a white paper, by the way, on the Renewal Works website, renewalworks.org. I think it's /research summary. You can get the summary paper of what we've learned. But one of the things are some catalysts for spiritual growth. the things that we know, practices that we know are likely to provoke people to become more mature Christians. And it's not surprising that for a new Christian, Eucharist is one of the most important ones, just coming to church. Scripture engagement's important all along the way. Prayer is important, and not only is prayer important, but the kind of prayer that people offer changes. People who are new Christians begin by praying, asking for God stuff all the time. Give me this, give me that. And people learn to pray in gratitude. People learn to pray for other people. And eventually, really mature Christians learn to pray for direction. Actually saying prayers to God and believing that God might lead us. And so I would say pay attention to those catalysts. And when we wonder why our church is filled with a lot of Christians who are not particularly mature, you'll see when you look at the catalysts, none of them is very complicated or clever or novel. And most of them are things that we don't offer in many of our parish churches. And there's no reason not to. We could offer them. If I'm happy to take more questions as long as you all like. I'll also say I love getting feedback and suggestions and ideas. So I'm on sabbatical right now, so I may not get back in touch with you right away. If you find me on Facebook or Twitter or something, I will, because you'll catch me there. But I would love to be in touch if you ever have feedback on something that you see from Forward Movement, good or bad, or if you have suggestions for something that you think Forward Movement should be doing, or you have something that you'd like to work with Forward Movement in offering, I am all ears. And Rhonda has something.
Yeah, so Rhonda has written a chat. She says, in my experience as vicar of a tiny church that did offer morning and evening prayer daily, praying those offices and letting it be known that we do so can be a powerful tool for evangelism. It allows non-baptized persons to experience the Anglican way and perhaps begin a path of inquiry while avoiding the questions of communing the unbaptized.
Yes, 1,000 times yes. It's ironic, isn't it, that we Anglicans had the perfect Sunday morning seeker service, this beautiful catechetical offering of praise and thanks in morning prayer, and we stopped doing it right as Christendom crumbled. and now we offer Eucharist, which is maybe less suited to seekers. So yeah, I think I've heard so many stories of people who came into and I'm one of them actually. It was evensong for me. Eucharist would have scared the bejesus out of me when I became an Anglican. But I've heard so many stories of people who came into our church through the office, and perhaps in our being Way of Love, Jesus Movement people, one of the ways we do that is offering morning and evening prayer.
Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank you, Scott, for giving us your time and for this wonderful resource. And thank you to Walt for leading our conversation. It's been very stimulating. And as I mentioned before, the video of this webinar will be posted later to YouTube, and the audio will come out in podcast form. And you can find both of those on our website, which is scholarpriests.org, or on our Facebook page for the Society of Scholar Priests. So again, we thank you for Scott. And then also, we have something else here. Thanks to George T-Dog for his cameo appearance in the background too.
Yeah. Yes. I'll make sure to pass him along. He's going to want his residual royalties or something for having been in this, but I'll talk to him about that.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was a treat.